I paid for my son's entire wedding, $150,000. But during the very first speech, my daughter-in-law looked straight at my wife and said, "Some people think sacrificing a little money is enough to earn respect." A few quiet laughs rippled across the room. My wife just sat there, silent, wearing the same dress she had already altered twice. I didn't stand up. I didn't argue. I didn't say a single word. I simply picked up my phone and canceled the payment authorization for the honeymoon and the Manhattan penthouse apartment. The two of them had just been proudly showing off to everyone. That was the moment everything truly began. Before I continue this story, if you enjoy real family stories like this, please consider subscribing to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I usually read those comments every evening. But for now, let's go back to that night. After I set my phone down, the reception kept going as if nothing had happened. But for me, that was the moment everything started to change. The sound of that reception is still very clear in my memory. Crystal glasses touching each other. Soft jazz drifting through the grand hall of that Beverly Hills mansion. Everything looked like a perfect postcard of an upscale wedding. But I was standing at the edge of the room, in a dim corner near the glass doors that opened to the garden. I've never been the kind of man who enjoys places like that. Most of my life was spent in Charleston, South Carolina. An old house, a quiet street, and long afternoons sitting on the porch with Elizabeth. For us, a simple dinner and a cup of hot tea were enough to call a day complete. But that night, things were different. That wedding cost around $150,000. I know that number better than anyone, because every single dollar came out of my retirement account. I spent more than 40 years working as an engineer. Numbers, blueprints, and long days in an office. I've never been the kind of man who spends money to impress people. But James told me this wedding was important. He said Zoe's family cared a lot about appearances. He said a simple wedding might make them think we didn't respect our future daughter-in-law. Elizabeth looked at me for a long time when James said those things. She didn't argue. She rarely argues about anything involving our son. But I knew what she was thinking. I could see it in her eyes. We had never lived a flashy life. Still, in the end, I agreed. Not because of Beverly Hills. Not because of Zoe's family. Only because James is our son. I still remember the afternoon we transferred the deposit for the venue. Elizabeth was sitting beside me at the kitchen table. She was gently rubbing her lower back, as if she didn't want me to notice the pain. "Are we still okay?" she asked. I told her we were. I'm not entirely sure that answer was completely true. Now let me take you back to that evening. When Zoe stood up with the microphone, every eye in the room turned toward her. She was wearing an expensive white gown. The lights caught the fabric and made it almost glow. Zoe smiled. It was the same smile I had seen many times over the past 3 years. Very polite, but it rarely reached her eyes. She started with the usual words. Thanking friends, thanking family, talking about the journey she and James had shared. Everything flowed smoothly, until her gaze stopped on Elizabeth. My wife was sitting at the table near the front, close to the small stage where Zoe stood. She was wearing a light blue dress. I knew that dress well. Elizabeth had altered it twice in the past month because she said there was no need to buy a new one. I still remember her standing in front of the bedroom mirror, gently adjusting the hem. "Do you think this looks all right?" she asked me. I told her she looked beautiful. Zoe looked at Elizabeth for a few seconds. Then she said the sentence I mentioned earlier, that some people try to prove their presence through cheap sacrifices, hoping to earn respect. For the first few seconds, no one said anything. Then, a few small laughs came from the other side of the room. I'm not sure they fully understood what she meant. Maybe they thought it was just a slightly sharp joke. But I understood. Elizabeth understood too. She didn't react. She simply lowered her head slightly, the way a patient teacher waits for a classroom to grow quiet again. I have lived with Elizabeth for 42 years. I know when she's trying to hold herself together. That was one of those moments. And I didn't walk over. I didn't ask Zoe to explain herself. I didn't say a single word to James, who was standing beside her with a tight smile on his face. Instead, I took out my phone. The screen lit up in my hand. My bank account was connected to 3 major payments for the two of them: their honeymoon trip to Italy, the lease for a penthouse apartment in Manhattan, and a secondary credit card under James's name. I looked at those numbers for a few seconds. Then I opened the settings. Cancel authorization. The system asked for confirmation. I entered my password. A small message appeared on the screen. The change has been completed. I locked the phone. Across the room, Zoe was still speaking. People were still listening. The reception continued, as if nothing had happened. But there was one thing I understood very clearly. What I had just done would not end with a simple touch on a screen. It would open the door to a chain of events that, at that moment, even I could not fully see. And all of it started with a sentence that seemed very small. On a summer evening like that, a few minutes later, I stepped away from that corner of the room. Not because I wanted attention, I just needed a little quiet air. The garden behind the mansion looked out over the hills of Beverly Hills. Golden lights stretched along the distant roads, and the music from inside drifted out softly. I stood there, resting my hands on the stone railing. It wasn't the first time in the past 3 years that I had asked myself how things had reached this point. James, when he was a boy, wasn't the man I had just seen standing beside Zoe. Back then, he was a quiet kid. He liked taking apart old radios just to see what was inside them. Sometimes he would sit in the garage for hours, asking me questions about engineering drawings. But when he moved to New York for work, things started to change. At first, it was just late phone calls in the evening. "Dad, I'm trying to build my position here," he said. "In New York, people look at how you live before they listen to what you say." I didn't fully understand that, but I listened. Then those calls began to come with requests. The first time he said he needed money to invest in a business opportunity. The amount was $30,000. I transferred it the next morning. Elizabeth didn't say anything when she saw the transaction. Just a few weeks later, James called again. This time, it was $50,000. He said the company was expanding, and if he joined a new sales project, his income would grow quickly. Elizabeth still didn't argue, but I started noticing that she spent more time standing in the kitchen, looking at the bills spread across the table. One afternoon, she gently said, "Maybe we should sell the boat." That boat was something I kept after retirement. I didn't use it very often, but I liked knowing it was still there. I sold it a week later. The money went straight into James's account. Then Zoe entered his life. I met her for the first time during a dinner in Manhattan. The restaurant was on the upper floor of a building overlooking the Hudson River. Everything there was polished and quiet, in a way that made me feel like I was wearing the wrong clothes. Zoe spoke with a lot of confidence. She talked about her family in Connecticut, about trips to Europe, and about friends who worked in investment funds. James looked at her very differently. I think, even then, he had already decided he needed to live in her world. After that dinner, the money requests started coming more often. $20,000 for a deposit, $15,000 for a short-term investment opportunity, $40,000 for an unexpected legal issue. The total grew quickly. I didn't add it all up until the end of the second year. More than $200,000. Elizabeth knew that number, but she never once said we should stop. There was only one time she spoke about something for herself. It was on a winter morning. She had just come back from the clinic. The doctor said her spine was getting worse. If she wanted to avoid long-term pain, she would need surgery. The cost was around $40,000. I told her we would do it as soon as necessary. But just a few days later, James called again. His voice sounded more tense than usual. He said he was having trouble with a contract at work. If it wasn't resolved immediately, his career could be seriously affected. The amount he needed was almost exactly the same as Elizabeth's surgery. I remember that evening very clearly. Elizabeth was sitting at the kitchen table, one hand resting against her back. I told her James was in trouble. She stayed quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. "We help him first," she said. A few weeks later, Elizabeth had to spend a night in the hospital because the back pain became too strong. I sat beside her bed, scrolling through my phone while she slept. That's when I saw the photo. Zoe had posted it on Instagram. She was holding her hand up toward the camera, showing off a large diamond ring. Behind her was a very expensive restaurant. The caption was short, "Luckiest girl in the world." I looked at the date of the post. It was the exact same day we had transferred money to James. I never told Elizabeth about that photo. I never called James about it either. But from that moment on, a thought began to grow in my mind. Not every story my son told me matched the truth. The night air in Beverly Hills was a little cold. I was still standing on the balcony while those memories passed through my mind. Inside the house, the laughter continued. The reception wasn't over yet, but I knew the decision I had made just a few minutes earlier would change things. I just didn't know how yet. And I had no idea that what I would discover later was much bigger than a diamond ring. After standing on the balcony for a while, I went back inside. The reception was still moving along as if everything were perfectly normal. Servers passed by, carrying trays of drinks. The music had shifted to something slower. James and Zoe were standing in the center of the room, surrounded by their friends. Short bursts of laughter rose from the group. From a distance, it looked like the picture of a couple stepping into a perfect new life. I didn't walk toward them. Instead, I looked for Elizabeth. She was still sitting at the table near the front, one hand resting lightly on her glass of water. When I sat down beside her, she turned and looked at me. "I'm fine," she said quietly, before I could even ask. Elizabeth has always been that way. She protects other people from discomfort, even when she's the one who's been hurt. I simply nodded. We sat there for a few minutes watching people dance under the lights. Then a man approached our table. He looked a little over 60, wearing a gray suit. I remembered seeing him earlier during the ceremony, standing with a group from Zoe's side of the family. He stopped in front of me and gave a polite nod. "You're Paul, correct?" he asked. I nodded. "We haven't officially met," he said. "My name is Richard." Elizabeth gave a small smile, though I could tell she didn't recognize him either. Richard pulled out the chair beside us and sat down. "Sorry if I'm interrupting," he said, "but I think you should know a few things." That caught my attention. He didn't look toward Zoe or James. Instead, he looked straight at me, like a man deciding how much he should say. "I've known Zoe's family for quite a while," he continued. "Long before she moved to New York." I waited. Richard let out a quiet breath. "Perhaps I shouldn't say this at a wedding," he said, "but sometimes beautiful stories are built on foundations that aren't very stable. I've never liked vague talk. I spent my life working with engineering drawings. Something is either correct or it isn't. What exactly are you trying to say?" I asked. Richard glanced around the room once more, then lowered his voice. "Zoe's family isn't as wealthy as they usually claim." I didn't react right away. Over the past 3 years, I had heard plenty of stories about her family. Vacation homes, large investments, social events James said he had to attend to maintain connections. Richard gently shook his head. "Her father's company closed nearly 2 years ago," he said. "After that, there were quite a few debts." He paused, giving me time to absorb it. "Most of what you see now," he added, "is just appearance." A heavy silence settled in my mind. If that was true, then many things over the past 3 years started to make sense in a different way. Richard watched me for a few seconds. "Your son has probably helped them quite a bit," he said. I didn't answer that, but he seemed to understand my silence. "I'm not saying James is a bad man," Richard added. "I just think that when someone tries to maintain a very large image, they sometimes feel they must protect it at any cost." I thought about James's late-night calls, the urgent money transfers, the stories about opportunities and unexpected problems. After a few minutes, Richard stood up. "Well," he said, "I just thought you should know." He shook my hand and walked away. Elizabeth looked at me. "What did he say?" she asked softly. I thought for a few seconds before answering. "Just a few things about Zoe's family," I said. Elizabeth didn't ask anything else. But when I looked back toward the dance floor, another thought began forming in my mind. If Zoe's family was truly struggling financially, then the money James kept needing over the past 3 years might not have been simple investment opportunities. It could have been something else. 1 week after the wedding, I started reviewing my financial paperwork back in Charleston. I hadn't done that in years. I had always believed everything was still in order. But this time, there was an envelope from the bank that made me stop. It was a notice related to a mortgage loan. At the top of the page, the borrower's name was listed. James. I read that line twice. The property used as collateral was my house in Charleston, the home Elizabeth and I had lived in for decades. I did not remember signing any document like that. At the bottom of the page, there was a signature. My name. But when I looked closer, I knew immediately. That signature was not mine. And in that moment, I understood something. What was happening here was not just about large amounts of money or confusing stories. There was something deeper behind it, and this time, the person standing at the center of it was not only Zoe. I held that paper in my hands for a long time before I said anything to Elizabeth. That afternoon in Charleston was quiet, like it always was. Sunlight came through the living room window and fell across the wooden table where I had spread out the bank documents. Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing tea. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps. "What did you find?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I simply turned the paper toward her so she could see the signature at the bottom. Elizabeth put on her glasses and leaned down to read it line by line. I saw her shoulders stiffen slightly. "We didn't sign this," she said softly. "No," I replied. "It wasn't a small loan. If the bank chose to enforce their terms, the house we had lived in for more than 40 years might no longer belong to us." Elizabeth placed the paper back on the table. She didn't ask why James would do something like that. Maybe she had already begun to understand. So had I. For years I believed my son was simply trying to prove himself in a big city. But now things were starting to come together into a different picture. The urgent money transfers, the unclear stories, and now, mortgage papers with a forged signature. 3 weeks after the wedding, I received a phone call from James. His voice sounded different from usual. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk." I knew that call would come sooner or later. The penthouse apartment in Manhattan he planned to move into was no longer available. The lease depended on automatic payments I had canceled on the night of the wedding. The honeymoon trip to Italy had been canceled 2 days later as well. I never explained anything. I simply allowed the financial agreements to follow their own rules. James flew to Charleston a few days later. He arrived late in the afternoon. I was sitting on the front porch when the rental car stopped at the gate. James stepped out, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. He sat down in the chair across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "You canceled all the payments," he said. "I know," I answered. James let out a slow breath, trying to stay calm. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under in New York." I looked at him. "Maybe not," I said. "But I do understand numbers." I stood up and brought out the folder from the bank. I placed the mortgage document on the table between us. James looked down at it, only for a second, but I saw the change in his eyes. "It's not what you think," he said quickly. "Then explain it," I said. James began talking fast. He said Zoe's family was going through temporary financial trouble. He said her father needed money to resolve some debts. He said that if they helped the family get through this period, everything would be fine. I let him finish. "And you thought the best solution was to use our house as collateral?" I asked. James didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said something else. "You could sell this house," he said. "We could move somewhere smaller. If we just put in a little more money, I can turn everything around." Elizabeth was standing in the doorway behind us. I didn't know how much she had heard, but I saw her hand tighten around the doorframe. I turned back to James. For many years, I believed it was my job to protect my son from the hardships of the world. But at that moment, I realized something simple. Sometimes, the greatest hardship comes from the choices a person makes for himself. "James," I said slowly, "come back here tomorrow night." He looked at me surprised. "Why, I'm inviting you to dinner," I said. "Just us, your mother and me, and one other person." James frowned. "Who? I think it's best if you meet him in person," I said. The next evening, when James returned, the dining table, in the living room, was already set. Elizabeth had placed 3 plates, and the 4th chair already had someone sitting in it. It was our family lawyer. On the table in front of him was a thick stack of documents. When James walked into the room and saw him, I knew he understood. This dinner was not about selling the house. It was about deciding what would happen next to our family. James stood still for a few seconds in the doorway when he saw the lawyer. His eyes moved across the table, past the thick stack of documents, and finally stopped on me. Elizabeth pulled out a chair and motioned for our son to sit. "Eat first," she said gently. "The food will get cold." Dinner began in silence. The sound of silverware touching the plates seemed louder than usual. I've lived long enough to know some conversations need a quiet moment before they begin. After a few minutes, our lawyer, Mr. Harris, opened the folder. He had handled our family's legal matters for more than 20 years. He wasn't a man who talked much, and that's one reason I trusted him. "James, Mr. Harris said calmly, "We've reviewed the mortgage connected to the Charleston house." James didn't look at him. He stared down at the table. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said. Mr. Harris nodded slightly. "That may be true," he replied, "but a forged signature on financial documents is still a serious matter." The air in the room grew heavy. Elizabeth rested her hand lightly on the table. I knew she was trying to keep things from sliding in a different direction. I looked at James. "I didn't call the police," I said. James lifted his head immediately. But I continued, "We need to bring this to a clear end." Mr. Harris slid the folder toward him. "This is a waiver of inheritance rights," he explained. "If you sign it, the mortgage situation will be handled another way. Your parents will keep the house." James stared at the pages for a long time. I didn't rush him. Some decisions a man has to make on his own. Finally, he picked up the pen. I saw his hand tremble slightly as he signed the last line. When the pen left the paper, the room became strangely quiet. No arguments, no accusations, just an old chapter, closing. A few weeks later, the marriage between James and Zoe began to crack. I didn't need to investigate. The news found its way to me. Zoe stopped talking about their plans in Manhattan. The photos of that glamorous life disappeared. 2 months later, James called me again. He said Zoe had left. I didn't ask for details. Some stories don't need to be dug into any deeper. James started working at a parking lot near Newark Airport to slowly pay off his debts. It wasn't the job he once imagined for himself. But sometimes, a man has to start again, from very small things. Elizabeth still sent him messages from time to time just to check on him. She has always been that kind of person. And we finally began taking care of the things we had postponed for too long. Elizabeth's spine surgery took place early the following spring. I sat in the waiting room for 4 hours. When the doctor walked out and said everything had gone well, it felt like I was breathing out after holding my breath for a very long time. Elizabeth recovered slowly, but steadily. For the first time in years, she could walk around the neighborhood without stopping because of the pain in her back. A few months later, we sold some old investments and started planning a trip Elizabeth had mentioned many times before. Not Beverly Hills, not Manhattan, just quiet places we wanted to see before it was too late. One summer afternoon, we were sitting on the beach in Charleston. The waves rolled in steadily, like the slow breathing of the ocean. Elizabeth sat beside me, her feet touching the shallow water. She turned and looked at me. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" I asked. "The past few years," she said. I thought about it for a moment. Then I shook my head. "No," I said. I looked out toward the horizon. "We spend our lives teaching our children how to fly," I said slowly. "But that doesn't mean we have to cut off our own wings, just to become their feathers." Elizabeth smiled softly. The sea breeze moved across the sand, carrying that familiar smell of salt. In that moment, I realized something simple. Life isn't always fair, but sometimes if a person is patient enough to stand their ground, they can still find the quiet years they thought were lost. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this story made you think about family, about respect, and about the quiet sacrifices parents make, I hope you'll take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so others can hear it too. In life, we are often willing to give everything to the people we love. But this story reminded me of something important. A parent's love can be unconditional, but respect is something that must always be valued and returned. I wish peace for you and your family. And if you're still here, thank you for listening.